Tilde, academic conservatism, and neo-academia, or I suppose new academia, if you prefer. A sentence that probably makes a kind of sense to some, but no sense at all to others on account of these being words or phrases that don't really exist, and I've just tailored to help illustrate the point that I want to wax lyrically about for a while today. And it's in some ways about peer review and its various pitfalls, the future potential for human knowledge, and the dangers of slipping into outright conservatism in regards to academia, or I suppose to invent yet another ridiculous phrase that sounds like it should mean something, neo-reactionary academics. Anyway, enough with making up nonsense phrases, and on with the actual concepts. The internet is a wonderful tool. It contains an overwhelming amount of the sum total of human knowledge in various forms, ranging from the massively complex scientific theories down to the plain mundane nonsense of everyday human social interactions. Everything that is here, right now, is a massive amount of information that is a beautiful snapshot of the existence of the human species and its nigh infinite complexity. When the internet was young, it was spoken about as a great new frontier, a brand new world, borderless, with no limit on property space as we have in the physical world. If someone wanted to create a space, a virtual place to live for their thoughts, if you will, you can just do it. And there was a sense of amazement, a sense of awe that such a thing could exist, that we could instantly transfer the thoughts of people separated by thousands of miles in a mere instant and have them available forever recorded for anyone to explore these ideas and either pare them down or expand them infinitely until we were able to finally total together all the pieces of humanity's knowledge and thus be able to transcend any lack of information or misinformation that we might have while always working towards more. And this information would be free and available to all. Any person could locate any information that they needed or wanted, from academic papers and theories to simple entertainment and mundane general knowledge facts. Better yet, people could bring any of this together, analyse it in whatever way they saw fit, present this information and have it, in essence, peer-reviewed nearly instantly by dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people potentially. It promised to put academic knowledge in the hands of everyone. No longer would we be subjects to enclosed academics and think tanks being bought off by private funding and grants or succumbing to their own internal biases. Indeed, anyone who has ever faced the peer review process will be aware of its many features, which I think should be laid out here for clarity. You would work on your paper for however long it takes you to gather resources, create methods, gather your own data if need be, analyze data, etc. This can take 1 year, 2 years, 3, 4 years, however long. Once complete, you can submit it to a journal of your choice, where an editor then has 2 real choices. 1. Desk rejection right on the spot, which may happen because you've picked the wrong journal and your paper simply wouldn't fit. It might be rejected because it doesn't reach the quality standard of the journal, and there's always the risk that the editor is prone to significant bias and simply doesn't like you or your topic or its implications, at which point you might try again and hope for a different editor or go for a different journal. Yes, things like political and personal bias absolutely do exist within the peer review and journaling process. Choice number 2, the editor will then pass your paper on to various other members of the editorial board, some of whom will be selected because their specialization matches the topic of your paper, or it might be handed to an outside researcher if that journal is lacking a specialist, who can then give your work an appropriate review. After this peer review of your work, you will receive an editorial letter that will either accept publication, very rare on your first try, but more likely will contain a list of recommended changes. These can vary from requests to change methodology, requests to clarify variables or control for variables, suggestions that there may be other papers you should read first because they've already covered a part of your research that you missed. The list goes on. At this point, you review your work and either make the suggested corrections, or you explain why you think these corrections are not needed and resubmit to your editor and peers. This process will go through multiple rounds until you eventually end up with your finished and hopefully improved paper. Of course, this comes with its flaws. There are cases where your peers simply hold ideological views that are opposed to the topic or implications of your paper, at which point they will offer advice that is less than helpful. There are journals with peers who are simply, for lack of a better term, not very good, who will miss faults with your paper, or in some cases intentionally allow faults if the results of your paper coincides with their own works or biases. Basically, peer review can be an amazing tool for good, but can also be an incredibly biased tool to almost echo chamber levels, depending on what journal it is that you are submitting to. Why do I bring this up? Well, I consider both of these topics to be two parts of a whole to be considered together with some sweet irony. The advent of the internet gave us near unlimited communication ability to improve our own knowledge and works as we see fit, and yet, when new ideas come out of such a source, despite the fact that the internet contains many very intelligent people, some of whom are even on peer review boards or work in a position to be considered a peer on a piece of work, anything that is produced from such a forum by individuals without the right credentials, as it were, is instantly mocked and derided as worthless because it didn't come from academia. It didn't come from an official research organization and therefore must be worthless. It creates a form of academic conservatism that is really rather unusual and is something we see coming up semi-frequently. People who will simply refuse or deny the findings of something unless it comes from the hallowed grounds of academia, despite academia having many flaws and the ability to fall into echo chamber level confirmation bias. I've seen scholars have their work rejected in some cases for the most mundane of reasons, such as the author didn't cite enough of the reviewing peer's works and was thus rejected. And I've seen scholars have their work dismissed for no other reason than it is not in a peer-reviewed journal, despite being methodologically sound, and in many ways actually better than some research we've seen coming out of academia. For example, feminist glaciology, a paper that went through peer review, a fact that still sends chills down my spine, knowing that out there is a journal with enough editors and peers to get such nonsense published in such a way that it appears to a layperson to actually have some degree of credibility. If a journal is biased enough to have such a piece of work published within its pages, what chance do you think an author would have if they were in the same field getting their work published in that journal if they are openly hostile towards the ideology of feminism? Well, it's quite simple. Their work would never see the light of day. Not in that peer-reviewed journal anyway. Which might leave them to have to submit their work to an independent think tank or on their own personal websites, where, even if their research is sound, it can be simply hand-waved away for not being from the correct source. To the naysayers suggesting that non-academics can never hold value, I remind them of the discovery of the Mpemba effect, an observation made by Erasto Mpemba, born in 1950, who observed that in some circumstances warm water can freeze faster than cold water, an observation that can be frequently reproduced. The method by which this happens is still up for debate. But the most important part of this tale is that Mpemba made his observations in 1963. At the age of 10, when he and other students in his Year 3 class would make ice cream by boiling milk, adding sugar and then freezing it, one day with limited space in the freezer, Mpemba was boiling his milk. A classmate, in a rush to not lose his space in the freezer, simply mixed his milk with sugar and placed it, cold, into the freezer. Mpemba finished boiling his milk, mixed in the sugar, and placed his in the freezer. 2 hours later, Mpemba's ice cream had frozen, and his friend's was still a thick sludge. When Mpemba asked his teacher as to why, his teacher simply told him, "This cannot happen. You are mistaken." 3 years later, Mpemba, wanting to demonstrate he was right, took 2 50 cubic centimetre beakers, filled one with cold water, one with hot water, placed them in a freezer, and his findings were replicated. When confronting his teacher, Mr. Osborne, about this, his teacher promised he would research this further himself, while Mpemba's peers mocked him, saying he had shamed his class for asking such questions. True to his word, however, his teacher did research this further. and to this day this phenomenon is still being observed and debated. All this as the result of one 13-year-old boy's curiosity and some home-based experiments. I suppose the moral here is, do not be so fast to judge and dismiss the findings of people just because they are not academics, or just because their work has not been peer-reviewed. Will it be perfect? Almost certainly not. Nothing is the first time around, but to instantly hand-wave away a hypothesis because of its source is simply ridiculous, in the same way that blindly accepting something because of its source is ridiculous. I say this because we live in the internet age. We are able, right now, to assess data and studies in ways and on a scale we simply couldn't before when information was locked purely in academic halls. People are researching, providing new ideas, new thoughts, new observations every day, and when these findings and hypotheses are presented, they will often find themselves being ridiculed and mocked, or there will be outright cries of, "This paper and conclusions didn't come from a certified academic, so we can't trust it." If there are large amounts of data suggesting trends, investigate. Don't just skim an abstract and accept or dismiss based on how you think or feel the data should or shouldn't be, or because you do or don't like the person who presented it. Or you may find yourself to be no better than Mpemba's classmates when they ridiculed him for pointing out a simple, observable truth. Hopefully this has given you something to think about. I know it's been on my mind for a while now, how even the same things coming from two different points will be accepted very differently by a wider audience, and I do worry that the fear of non-academics doing new and interesting research and groundwork will hamper any real independent research and growth. The fear people have of knowledge being found and used seems to sometimes cause a bizarre knee-jerk reaction and demand that knowledge must only be used or produced by academics, and that there are those out there whose work is being delegitimized for no other reason than the platform they use to spread their ideas.